In the 13th century, no name inspired more fear than that of the Mongols. Warriors who seemed to appear out of the wind, burning everything in their path. From the heart of Asia, they had created the largest continuous empire in human history. Entire cities vanished. Armies once considered invincible were destroyed in days. Under the command of Genghis Khan, the world learned the meaning of the word inevitable. And even after his death, his descendants continued the expansion, spreading terror to the very gates of Europe. In 1241, the Mongols crossed Hungary and devastated Poland. The West realized that neither walls nor faith were enough to stop this enemy. But something would change in the decades that followed. When the bitter winter of 1287 arrived, the Golden Horde, led by Talabuga Khan and Nogai Khan, returned to try to dominate the heart of Europe once more. They expected to find a divided and defenseless kingdom. What they found was a people who had already learned from fear and were now ready to face it. This is the story of how Poland, against all odds, rose up to stop the army the world called unstoppable. In the heart of Europe, surrounded by empires and threats, Poland was a kingdom fighting not only against external enemies, but also against its own wounds. Decades before the Mongol invasion, the country had fragmented into several duchies, each ruled by a local prince more concerned with his own domain than with the fate of the kingdom. It was a time of disunity where central power had almost disappeared, but one man began to change that fate. Leszek II the Black, Duke of Kraków and heir to a lineage marked by conflict, Leszek was a ruler of a difficult temperament but sharp intelligence. Still young, he led campaigns against the Prussians and the Ruthenians, warrior peoples from the north and east. In each battle, he learned something few European princes understood: how to face an enemy that moves like the wind. Gradually, he restored authority over much of Poland, rebuilding castles, training militias, and strengthening cities that had been destroyed in previous invasions. And in Kraków, the heart of the kingdom, a stone fortress rose, a symbol that Poland would no longer be taken by fire. Still, Leszek knew that walls alone could not stop a storm. He would need to unite not only armies, but hearts. For when the Golden Horde returned, Poland could not fight as a collection of duchies, it would have to fight as a nation. On the other side of the frozen steppes, far beyond the Carpathians, the drums of the Golden Horde echoed once again. Command was divided between two men and two temperaments. Talabuga Khan, young, ambitious, a direct descendant of Genghis, a warrior who believed in the power of blood and destiny, and Nogai Khan, veteran, cold and calculating, more politician than soldier. He was called the king without a throne, for he was the one truly moving the pieces within the horde. Together, they decided that Poland would be their next target, not for glory, but for strategy. If the kingdom were destroyed, Hungary, which had already repelled the Mongols in 1285, would be isolated and vulnerable. The plan was simple and terribly efficient. The horde would split into two armies. Talabuga would march through the north, crossing the Vistula River toward Sandomierz, devastating villages and gathering supplies. Nogai, with 10,000 elite cavalry, would come from the south, heading to Kraków, the heart of Poland. The two armies would meet afterward, surrounding the enemy between iron and fire. As always, the orders were clear: strike with speed, disappear before a response, and leave only ashes. But what Nogai and Talabuga did not know was that the winter would be harsher than expected, and this time, the Poles were ready and waiting for them. In the heart of Poland, Kraków rose like a jewel amid the winter. Decades earlier, its walls had been made of wood, fragile against Mongol fire. Now they stood in solid stone, cold as steel and as resilient as the will of its people. The city had risen from the ashes. Artisans, masons, and peasants worked side by side to erect towers, walls, and catapults. It was not just a fortress, it was a silent vow, never again. Every village around followed the example. Wooden forts were replaced by stone bastions. Deep moats protected the passages, and mounted messengers crossed the plains, carrying alerts and orders. Under the command of Leszek II, the Black, the defense was not limited to the walls. He knew the true wall lay in the courage of those who defended them. Soldiers, knights, and simple peasants were gathered. Few wore shining armor. Most carried improvised spears, sickles, and courage. In the churches, bells rang day and night, not in celebration, but as a warning. The storm was approaching. From afar, patrols could already see columns of smoke on the horizon. Burned villages, plundered farms. The Mongols had crossed the Vistula. And this time, the roar of the steppes would not find a fleeing people, but a people determined to resist to the last man. It was December. The land was covered in snow and silence, that heavy silence that comes before chaos. Tellabua Khan's columns advanced through the north, confident. Men and horses moved as a single living creature, their manes frozen, eyes fixed on the horizon. They had crossed the Vistula River, but the path had not been easy. The waters were not frozen as they had expected, and many drowned trying to cross. Even so, the army pressed on, pillaging villages and burning everything in its path. Their objective was to take Sandomierz, but its walls held strong. Frustrated, Tallabooga ordered the siege abandoned and marched south in search of easier targets. He did not know he was being hunted. In the forests near the village of Wago, Leszek III and his knights had set a trap. They knew the terrain, the passes, and the winds. When the Mongols approached, tired and scattered, the Poles struck. The clash was brutal, spears against spears, neighs and screams blending with the biting cold. Tallabooga's army tried to regroup, but the ambush was devastating. For the first time in decades, a European force defeated the Mongols in open field. Tallabooga retreated, leaving behind bodies, horses, and the bruised pride of the horde. On the white hills of Wago, Poland had proven the unthinkable. The terror of the steppes could bleed.
As Tallabooga retreated humiliated in the north, the south was ablaze. Nogai Khan, the other commander of the Golden Horde, had crossed the borders with 10,000 horsemen. His target was clear: Kraków. It was the eve of Christmas 1287 when the Mongol columns surrounded the city. From the walls, the bells rang in despair. Inside, peasants and warriors crowded the towers and ramparts, staring out at the sea of enemy tents stretching to the horizon. Nogai believed that a direct assault would be enough to break the defenses, as in previous invasions. But the stone walls raised under Leszek held firm. Polish catapults hurled burning stones, breaking enemy formations and setting camps ablaze. The horde responded with fire arrows, but the wind turned against them. The flames backfired, consuming their own machines. The siege, meant to last days, descended into chaos. Nogai lost key generals and hundreds of warriors. Frustrated, he abandoned the frontal attack and ordered his troops to disperse across the surrounding areas, pillaging villages and trying to break the resistance through fear. But now, every Polish village fought like a fortress. The enemy they had called invincible began to falter, to hesitate. Kraków stood tall, shrouded in smoke and snow, but alive. And in the shadows of the walls, messengers rode south, carrying a desperate plea for help. Poland was calling Hungary.
When all seemed on the brink of disaster, Leszek II made a risky and desperate decision. Leaving part of his forces in Kraków, he set out with a small group of knights and his wife, heading south across snow-covered forests and mountains. Their destination? The court of King Ladislas IV of Hungary. The two kingdoms had intertwined histories, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals. But before the Golden Horde, there was no room for division. Leszek sought help, not just as a duke, but as a brother-in-arms. Ladislas answered the call. The king sent a contingent of knights led by one of his bravest commanders, George of Sovar, a noble of modest origin but of legendary reputation. As the eastern winds carried rumors of burned villages, George marched north, crossing the Carpathians with battle-hardened Hungarian troops. Along the way, he was joined by Polish militias, survivors of devastated villages, local knights and mercenaries. It was not a uniform army, it was an improvised coalition of people who refused to die. When they finally crossed the plains of Sącz, they heard the drums of the horde in the distance. And in that moment, under the gray winter sky, Poles and Hungarians became one army, united not by flags, but by the certainty that if they fell, Europe would fall with them.
Dawn broke red over the frozen fields of Stary Sącz. The snow, once pure, had been trampled by horses and stained with the blood of the previous days. Nogai Khan believed victory was only a matter of time. The Poles were exhausted and Hungarian reinforcements were few. But what he did not know was that George of Sovar had laid a trap. While a small Polish vanguard feigned retreat, the main forces waited hidden among hills and forests. When the horde advanced confidently, the flanks closed like blades. Hungarian knights descended like a storm. The thunder of impact echoed through the mountains. Spears shattered, arrows fell like rain, and the Mongol line began to give way. Nogai tried to regroup, ordering a counter-encirclement, but it was too late. The Allied coalition pressed with brutal force, Polish archers targeting the horses, Hungarians charging with long swords, and cries cutting through the freezing air. In a few hours, the battlefield became a chaos of bodies, smoke, and dirty snow. When the sun set, the Golden Horde retreated, for the first time in decades, pursued by enemies who had once feared their name. The victory at Stary Sącz was not just a military triumph, it was a message. Mongol terror could bleed. And that winter, on the frozen plains of Poland, the myth of the Horde's invincibility began to die.
As winter tightened its grip, the eastern winds carried with them the roar of the Golden Horde. Nogai Khan and Talabuga Khan gathered the remaining forces, beaten and demoralized. The army that had arrived like a storm now seemed only a shadow, dragging itself across the snow-covered fields. There was no glory left, only the memory of successive defeats. Sandomierz had held, Lagos had been a massacre, Kraków remained intact, and Stary Sącz had dealt the final blow. As they retreated, looted villages watched the Mongol riders with a mix of relief and defiance. There were no triumphs, only the certainty that Poland would no longer be easy prey. The union of Poles and Hungarians had shown the world something no pillage could erase. Courage, strategy, and cooperation could contain even the greatest army on earth. On the frozen steppes, rumors of rivalry between Nogai Khan and Talabuga Khan began to grow. The horde itself, fragmented and exhausted, would face internal crises that prevented any new invasion of Central Europe. For Poland, the victory was far more than military. It was a symbol of resistance, proof that the nation could survive the terror that had once seemed invincible. And when silence returned to the plains, it was not just the snow that covered the ground. It was the mark that Europe's most feared enemy had finally been contained. If you enjoyed learning about this epic resistance, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss more incredible stories like this.